SMB Investor with Nick Bryant and Sean Smith.
Hey everyone, you got Sean Smith here, managing partner of Search Fund Ventures and founder of SMB Investor Network. And today I'm joined by Lisa Piercey, who's got extensive career buying businesses, leading businesses. She's got a lot of healthcare experience as well that she'll talk about. And she recently wrote a book about buying businesses. So Lisa, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
Why don't we kick it off by going through an overview of your career, talk about how you got into the business buying world and then some of the businesses you've bought, and then, what ultimately led you to write the book on it.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So, as my kids say, I used to be a real doctor. So, I am a physician by training and practiced for 5 years. Then found myself a little restless, a little unfulfilled, loved what I did, but just wanted a little bit more. So, I ended up going back to business school and thought it would just be an interesting background to have as I worked in for profit healthcare. And I did my master's thesis in a very large not-for-profit healthcare setting. And so was able to blend healthcare and business there and see how both of those levers played with each other. And not only we could serve patients better, but we could do better in the business. So over time, I transitioned into full-time healthcare administration with the exception of a half day a week clinical practice, which I continue to do and have always done. But then that began my health system journey. So I essentially ran hospitals for a decade, and that was everything from rural hospitals and behavioral hospitals to very large hospital operations. One of the hardest things I ever did was run food service in a very large flagship hospital. Lots of moving parts there, but I learned a lot about just general operations. And that's where I really started learning about how to take care of people outside of the clinical setting. I'd always known or interacted a lot with other physicians and nurses and clinical personnel, but that was my first exposure to non-clinical personnel. And they're quite different. So after about 10 years of doing that, I found myself gravitating more towards rural healthcare, which aligned with our new governor in Tennessee with his. And so we've struggled with some rural healthcare issues in Tennessee. And so he asked me to join the cabinet as the top health official is in his cabinet right at inauguration with him. And so I came in as commissioner of health for Tennessee, and we worked on rural health and opioids and dental care for the uninsured. And then about 14 months into his term was the pandemic. And so the last 3 years of our first term was pandemic management and all the things that came along with that. And everybody's well aware of that, but crisis management, lots of media interactions, and dealing with a communication issue of how do you talk to people about something that's very scary and you really don't have all the facts. And so when the pandemic was waning, we were getting towards his reelection. And so when he was reelected, I thought, well, I'll go back to running hospitals. That's what I knew how to do. And, that was an inflection point, I think, for a lot of us where we all kind of felt restless and we all felt like if we're going to do something, we need to do it now. And by this point, I was in my early to mid 40s. I had 4 kids in college or about to start college. And so it was a pivotal moment in my career. And I didn't want to go back into that bureaucracy. I wanted the autonomy. And it sounds kind of funny to say, but I wanted the risk. I wanted to feel the impact of the decisions that I made because I'd worked in these large corporate entities that if I made a mistake, or likewise, if I did really well, that's great, or well, that's okay. And so when I was moving towards that, I thought, I think I need to buy a business because I want to be able to use the leadership skills that I've accumulated over the years, and I want to be able to do something that not only allows me to fulfill my mission and I can make it mine, but something that would create wealth for myself and my family.
Very neat. And what a journey. I mean, the common thread of healthcare and ever increasing levels of responsibility and operational kind of oversight in the healthcare space is neat. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the first acquisition you made was also in the healthcare space. And you've always, one thing I think we're very much in alignment on, share the opinion with me that it's critical for business buyers to have some good experience in the industries they're acquiring. So, would love to hear about what drove you to the first business you bought, kind of how that all came to fruition? I know some of that's a lot of that's in your book as well, so people can read about it there. But
Sure. Yeah. Happy to speak into that. So sometimes feels like a little bit of a hot take or a contrarian view, but I'm pretty adamant that people who buy businesses have industry experience. I think that serves themselves better. I think that serves their customers and their employees better. And frankly, I think it serves the investors better. All of my acquisitions have been in healthcare because that's all I know. And, I've been tempted to do things outside of healthcare because there feels like there's some adjacencies that I could probably transition to, and I probably could. But I'm a girl that likes to stick with what she knows. And I also encourage that in other business buyers because you've already got a leg up. You've got a network. You've already been knocked down several times and you know how to dodge those and how to get out. And you also know the very nuanced problems that come with a particular industry. I wouldn't have a clue what the problems are in HVAC business. I mean, I could probably look at the revenue cycle and say this is inefficient, or, I could probably help with some hiring practices or SOPs. But I don't know the nuanced levers of that business, but I do in healthcare. And that's not only going to keep you out of the proverbial ditch, but that's what's going to generate that alpha. Because when you really know operations and know that business, you can start to identify those things that you can double down on and really, really make work for you. So for me, I wrote my first thesis. My first acquisition was through a traditional search fund. And so I wrote a thesis that was specific to healthcare, but otherwise fairly broad. And if you would have asked me on day one, do you think you would acquire a specialty pharmacy? I would have said, no, I don't really know anything about the pharmacy business. I've run hospitals that have pharmacies in them, but that's not the same. But when I put it in the frame of my search thesis, I thought, yeah, that does fit. And it gave me enough difference from what I had been doing that it re-energized me. It made me used a different part of my brain. It helped me develop professionally. But most of the same skills and most of the same infrastructure and environment were familiar. And so that helped me on that one. And so I did that one. And then I've subsequently done two more in healthcare and working on another one right now that are all different flavors of healthcare than I've had before. But those central themes are what helps me keep going.
very interesting. And I want to come back to, maybe a little more specifics on what your thesis was and some of those central themes in just a sec. But you listed 3 things that can drive alpha when an operator knows the industry they're buying in, right? One thing that you've talked about in articles you've written and in the book to some degree, but I don't think you mentioned was just the level of credibility you can come to the table with and the trust that can build from the team and from customers and really any stakeholder, right? The fact that they know that you know what you're talking about because you've been in the industry, you've done it before. That's a really important point. And, just to share some examples from what we've seen, we have backed plenty of folks who have, call it more generalist type business experience and have bought a more technical trade or something similar. And one of the frequent challenges that comes up is that the team may not necessarily view them as credible in the space to start. And that can cause things like not the best bidding practices, right? Padding bids or things of that nature that ultimately fly under the radar if you don't know what to look for. So the only real solve that I think we've seen is you got to bring somebody in alongside the more generalist person, whether that's a president type or a GM or just someone who can have that level of credibility. And there's really strong trust between a leader that doesn't have the industry background and someone who's supporting, a lieutenant who does have the industry background. That's really the only way that we get comfortable, I'd say, with someone who's saying, hey, I'm going to go buy a business where I have no knowledge of the industry. I guess the only other caveat to that would be every so often folks ask us, hey, we don't have any, experience in this. Would you back us to buy a business? And we say, just look for the most simple possible business you can find where basically what you need to be doing is making sure that people show up on time and put on a good face. If you can find that, then we're a lot more comfortable. So I'll pause there. That was a monologue, but.
Well, no, I hear you and I agree with all of that. And there's one other component of trust that gives operators an advantage that you didn't mention, which is on the buying side. So when I'm competing with other buyers, now, more in an independent sponsor model, and I'm competing with, hypothetically, a 26-year-old searcher who is top of their Ivy League class, but has never actually even had a real job. And I'm competing against lower middle market PE who are very good at making businesses efficient and scalable, but have never really gotten out of a spreadsheet. They've never had to deal with their top sales rep who suddenly has cancer, which is what I'm dealing with in one of my businesses right now. They've never had to deal with fill in the blank. What do you do when there's an accreditation finding and you have to shift process kind of at the busiest time of the year? Just all those different kinds of things. And not only does that help me in the buying process with the owner, because the seller wants to be able to see the next person who's going to be taking over this journey. And it's really hard to make that connection when you come from a different industry. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So not only does that build credibility with the seller and help in the buying process, but it also helps with even before the acquisition and during the acquisition with the management team and subsequently with the employees, because there's always skepticism when a new owner comes in, a new leader comes in. And then when you have to overcome that hurdle of, well, I'm sorry, you came from what industry? You just walk in behind the 8 ball. And so that's why I'm pretty adamant about making sure you have industry experience. There are people who do it without, but here's how I sum that up. Would you hire a CEO of your business who's never been in your industry before? I mean, maybe if you go from leading PepsiCo to Lowe's, there's
we know how that played out with Apple back in the day.
Yeah, right. But it's hard on a small scale when you don't have a lot of cushion and you don't have a lot of experience to bring somebody in that's just totally unfamiliar with the industry.
It's a great way to frame it. The point on buyers is a fantastic point. Especially, you're sitting in more of an independent sponsor seat now. If part of your offer to buyers is that they're going to roll equity and they're going to have a second bite at the apple, you got to sell yourself and you've got to sell your vision and your growth targets. It's going to be a lot easier for you to do that if you've got a really credible stance.
Yeah. And that also makes it easier to sell the vision because you've actually done things that have worked and have not worked in the industry in the past. So it does work quite well with sellers. And I hear a lot of that, of just kind of instant credibility and trust.
Yep. So I guess to kind of flip the point of view to that of investors, for investors who are, evaluating whether or not a searcher or a sponsor is a good fit, a lot of times the searcher doesn't have that perfect industry experience, but they may have some adjacencies that could fill enough of a gap for them to lead the business by themselves from day one, maybe bring in that kind of more skilled and familiar partner like we just talked about earlier. But how would you, if you were putting your investor hat on to back searchers, how would you think about really drilling into some of those more gray areas, right? There's examples where it's totally obvious and a no, right? Where there's just a complex business with someone who has no understanding or experience. And then there's a great fits like you were with your businesses. But what's kind of that middle ground and how would you go about thinking about it, to identify whether it could work?
Yeah. I mean, this exact example happened just a few months ago because I am also on the investing side too. I'm buying my own, but I frequently get called, and part of it is help me evaluate this deal, and part of it is, do you want to invest in this deal? And I got a call not too long ago from a guy who was probably in his late 20s, very strong business background. In fact, it was the president of an ETA club at a very reputable university. And he said, my best friend is finishing up his anesthesia residency, and he and I are we're considering buying an anesthesia practice. And so on the surface, he had great ideas on revenue cycle. He had great ideas on, actually the clinical practice, and his partner I didn't speak to his partner, but was telling me about that. And I thought, okay, on the surface, this looks good. And if I were an investor who didn't know about this industry, take my money. This is going to work great. These guys are sharp. But because I knew a little bit about the industry, I said, I took one more layer off the onion and said, okay, tell me how you're going to improve the revenue cycle. Well, I'm going to renegotiate payer contracts. Okay. And I'm sitting here thinking, wow, that's pretty tough. I've tried to do that before. And, who am I to United or Blue Cross? And so you dig a little bit further and you kind of get to a point where, yeah, I'm not sure even where to start there. Then on the same kind of thing, well, tell me about your partner and how are you going to work through all of the regulatory issues of all of these narcotics? Because if you know a little bit about anesthesia, all of the drugs they use are narcotics. It's a heavy regulatory environment. Okay, what does your partner know about the actual regulatory burden of having all of those narcotics and being responsible, much less all of the facility license and professional license? And so I think it's incumbent upon the investors to invest in areas that they know about because they don't know what the right questions to ask. And, I recognize that it's coming off as you can only operate and invest and buy businesses in the industry that you know, and that's not true. But that's where you're going to get the best outcomes because that's where the nuance comes in that can really come back to bite you.
That's really interesting, and I think it's an important call out, right? There's going to be, and maybe another way to phrase that is to say, if an investor chooses to invest in areas that they don't know as well, they should be aware that there's probably going to be a lot of unknown unknowns that they're not really going to be able to figure out until after, the deal is done and the issues pop up. One way we've thought about that, right, is because we look at so many deals across different industries is to say for more complex businesses, businesses that, for example, in healthcare where there's payer dynamics and revenue cycle and a lot of regulatory challenges, things like that just probably are a good bit more complex than a commercial cleaning company, for example. We want to see that there's much more mitigation in place, either through deal structure, through incentive alignment, through, the classic best diligence is buy really cheap type dynamics, things of that nature that ultimately we can lean on in going back to the spreadsheet cases to say some of this stuff we understand really well. We know what it's going to take to drive that. These other areas we've gotten familiar with, we've had some expert calls and learned, but we know that there's unknown unknowns that are going to pop up. So our mitigant is that we have a 3 times fixed charge coverage ratio or something similar. What I would be curious to get your take on kind of that approach as well for investors that do want to spread, across more areas that they might not be experts in.
Sure. And I will give the caveat that I've been burned twice. And so that's partly where that's coming from. I've invested in 2 different restaurants because guess what? I like to eat. And I thought I've been to a lot of nice restaurants and I like how this works, but I don't know the business part of restaurants. But if I were ever to invest in a restaurant again, I would try to engage somebody who did know that business. And so that doesn't mean I can't deploy capital outside of healthcare. It means that I need somebody in between. And you just mentioned, third party or expert. That's one way to do it. And certainly structuring the deal where you can mitigate against those risks is another way to do it. And I just had a conversation earlier today about a regulatory component. It's okay. Part of my diligence, I will pay for an extra inspection. Just because there haven't been any issues today doesn't mean that there's not going to be in the future. And so it could be an expert, it could be a deal structure, or it could be spending a little extra money in diligence. I mean, just like we do with quality of earnings. I mean, we would never, a good buyer would never just take the financials as is. You're going to have a third party to validate those and verify those. And that should really go for all pieces of the business. You need to, if it's a regulatory component or if it's fill in the blank, a clinical component, then you need to have somebody who knows what they're doing to do that. But deal structure is one way to do that. That it takes 2 to tango on that one, because that's sort of saying, I'm not sure I trust you on that. And so we're going to build this extra structure into there. And sometimes you can get away with that. Sometimes you can't.
Yeah. It's funny, one red flag that we always look out for is if there's some sort of liability that may, come up that was identified in diligence and a seller is very averse to having any type of rep or warranty in there or no chance for a stock deal or no chance for an asset deal. It's got to be a stock deal. That's when like you said, takes two to tango, and probably one person is not ready to dance. So
Yep, that's a red flag. That's a red flag. And, it brings up the point that it's a good tactic during diligence or negotiation to even float that because
right,
people who don't have anything to hide or, okay, fine. I think this is unnecessary, but if that's what it's going to take to get the deal done.
that's right. And I think the crux of my point is that if you can align seller incentives really well, I mean, if you think, what are the spectrums of that? Probably at the far end of unaligned is a fully cash at close deal with very limited kind of, reps and warranty and indemnification teeth or anything like that. The other end of the spectrum is, you're buying a business with a seller and they're co-personally guaranteeing an SBA loan, something of that nature. So testing those mechanics in between and for specific deal points, I think that's a really good call out that we haven't talked about as much.
And that's why I like the independent sponsor structure because every one of my deals is different and you have that flexibility, which is also something that I use as an advantage in the negotiation and in the buying process, which is, look, I can be flexible with this structure. I can be flexible with your rollover, with your future involvement. And you're really going to learn a lot about that seller and their priorities because just as you said, they're just trying to take the money and run. That's it's not always bad, but sometimes you need to pay a little closer attention.
That's right. Yep. Well, very good. So, let's circle back now to the kind of that original thesis when you first started crafting your thesis. How did you go about doing that? Obviously, dovetailing on the industry experience you've had and that kind of core principle that I think is so great that you've developed on following what you know, because that's going to be where the most alpha is. But yeah, tell us how you came to it, what it was, and then those central themes that you landed on that have now enabled you to kind of expand where you've bought.
Sure. So I thought about writing my initial search thesis and then ultimately now my investment thesis for our entire firm in what I like to consider a tight, loose, tight model. So I'm very tight about upfront defining it is this, it is not that. Loose in the middle, a loose interpretation, and like putting everything through that filter. And I'm not going to exclude anything. I'm going to use these criteria and then very tight on the back end. It is either that or it is not that. And having that kind of framework, and I'll tell you the specifics, but having that kind of framework was a very effective filter because if I were just looking for one thing, and spoiler alert, I thought I was just looking for one thing. I thought it was infusion center or an ambulatory surgery center. And I remember having my first couple of conversations about that. And I thought that's not it. And so I need to be defining the characteristics and keeping an open mind. I told you I didn't think I would ever consider a pharmacy. But when I compared it against my criteria, I'm like, that fits perfectly. So my criteria, I wanted healthcare services in the Southeast. So I'm based out of the Nashville area and I wanted it within driving distance. And I wanted it to be healthcare services. I'm not a device girl. I'm not a pharma girl. And I certainly don't know anything about healthcare technology. I use it, but I don't know anything about it. So healthcare services. Healthcare services in the Southeast. I had some financial criteria with my first one. It was EBITDA from 1 to 5 million. But then the two main ones were it has growth efficiencies through technology. And that on the surface, that's like, yeah, we kind of want all of our businesses to do that, right? But in healthcare, that's important because so many businesses in healthcare are provider dependent. So what does that mean? I can't grow or scale a family practice clinic. I mean, I could, but man, that's a hard deal because you've got brick and mortar and then you've got the people, the providers. So I wanted a healthcare business where I could actually have scale through use of technology. And healthcare, although it looks innovative at the core, it still needs some little help with technology. So I knew there was growth there. But I also wanted that service that I could scale to serve rural and underserved populations, because that's my passion, is serving populations specifically either in rural areas or in areas that might not be rural, but that are just underserved in a particular vertical of healthcare. And so when you put it through that, for example, my first acquisition was a specialty pharmacy in the wound care space. Now I'm a pediatrician by training. I don't know anything about taking care of wounds clinically, because that is generally an issue of older people. And I didn't know anything about pharmacy. We've already talked about that. But when I put it through the lens of, okay, yes, it's a services business. It's in Mississippi. That counts as the South. And it has some growth potential through technology. And I oftentimes joke about the fax machine test. If you're still using a fax machine and you're having a good business with those EBITDA criteria that I listed, if you can do that with a fax machine, wonder what we can do with a little AI or some other type of technology process. So yes, it was in the financial criteria. Yes, it was in services in the Southeast. It had quite a bit of scaling potential. They just had a Southeast footprint. And I thought, well, there's the whole nation we could scale to. But then when you start looking at what I really cared about, which was the mission of rural and underserved patients, wound care fits perfectly. And so you've got older, sicker, poorer patients, and this is a mail order format. So it comes directly to the home, overcoming those barriers of access and transportation. And all we dispense are generics. So you overcome that affordability barrier. This was just the holy grail for me. And if you would have told me at the outset, I think you should get a specialty pharmacy, I would have said, no, I don't, that's not that's as my kids say, that's not my jam. But when you put it through that lens, it really worked. And so I have used that same filter, a little bit tweaked from the criteria, but use that same filter, and it helps me instantly determine, is this in my buy box or is it not?
That's great. I love the focus, the ability to use judgment and interpret in the middle. And then we've talked about this a few times, but having as much of a binary filter as you can, rather than a scorecard that has a 1 to 10, which inherently just becomes qualitative
5, a
metric at
6.
that point. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I've known a lot of healthcare people that are, whether they're in search or independent sponsor, and I feel like they have too narrow of a focus and they're looking for one particular thing. Often, at least in my experience, they're looking for something like they've already done before, because that's familiar. I mean, specifically what they've done before. And even though I hadn't done pharmacy, it was very adjacent enough within healthcare that I could make that leap. But exactly what you said, I need to know quickly, as in when I get the teaser, is this a yes or a no? And if it's not a heck yeah, then we're gonna pass on it, because you're just wasting time, you're wasting energy with all of the deals that are like, maybe I could make this work.
Yep. No, that's great. We have a very similar process for reviewing teasers as quickly as we can in order to relentlessly disqualify, I would say.
That's right. It's efficient, but that feels icky to somebody who's in the 10th or 15th month of a search and they're just looking to do a deal. I think if you're not very disciplined about your criteria, that's when you start going down the slippery slope of, we probably shouldn't be pursuing this.
That's very interesting. So to add some color there, one thing we typically ask folks is, how long have you been searching? How many, LOIs have you signed? How many broken deals have you had? Partially, we ask some of those questions to get a sense for how seriously they're tracking their metrics. Are they running this like a business, this search?
Nice.
Do they know that stuff? Is it kind of systematized for them? But we also ask it because we know that the average search takes 12 to 24 months, and people bring us LOIs after a month or two. The only way that could be, that we kind of say, okay, this could be a great opportunity is if it's, someone from the industry who knows someone who, is close with an owner who has said, hey, I would really like you to be my successor, for example.
Sure.
Okay, fine. That's kind of an accidental search. That's a different scenario. But someone who's set out to search and is ready to buy their business after 1 month feels generally unlikely and is statistically pretty unlikely. So we ask the questions for those reasons. But to your point, getting to that 18-month mark and not having an incredible amount of fatigue, not feeling the burn and risks related to broken deal expenses racking up, especially true for like self-funded searchers and newer independent sponsors. If you don't have a disciplined criteria and thesis, you're probably falling apart at that point, right?
Well, yes, and you start making emotional decisions.
Right.
And you start thinking, I'll need to make this one work because I don't have much time left. I don't have much runway left. And then it becomes such a thing that you get emotionally attached, which is rule number 1, never, ever get emotionally attached. And then it becomes even harder to unwind because you think, well, then where's my income going to come from? And oh my goodness, I've been out of the workforce for 18 or 20 months. Am I going to go back to a W-2 job? And so the longer the search goes on, I think the more emotional it gets, a little bit of desperation creeps in. And if you don't have really strong criteria that you run your filter through, you're going to make a bad decision.
Well, this is great stuff. I mean, to sum up, like some of the key takeaways, there's going to be more alpha for folks who know their industry and can build trust with buyers, employees, know what to look for in diligence, the hidden stuff. That's both true for investors and searchers, buyers. Getting that disciplined buy box in place and really adhering to it. And from our perspective, doing what we can to figure out if searchers have had that from the start and kind of tracking along. I think those are some really great takeaways for investors to kind of add into their evaluation processes.
Yeah, and investors want to back searchers who know what they're doing. And so it's that emotional criteria, the using the criteria and not letting emotion creep in goes for investors too, because nobody wants capital to sit on the sidelines. And so if it's been a while or you get something that you're particularly jazzed up about, pretty quick to deploy the capital there. And the same advice applies. You have to be rigorous about using the lens of what is really going to work and what's not.
That's right. That's a great point. Well, look, we've got a few minutes left. Any kind of stories that stand out from either your search process or from running businesses or investing? You're kind of doing it all.
Probably the craziest story, I write about it in the book, is when I thought I was going to have a broken deal. This was with the pharmacy acquisition. We ran into a problem. It wasn't quite the 11th hour, but maybe hour number 10 and a half. And I thought, we've been working on this deal for 7 or 8 months. And the seller had had a broken deal before I came along. And so he was even more fatigued than I was. And so we had an audit issue that was nothing more than paperwork. We needed to get it. We needed to wait until all of it got done. It was fine, but we just had to wait for the process. So we came up with a creative little interim solution where I came on as contract CEO. During that time period, I retained an exclusive call option for 6 months. So he couldn't shop the deal while I was doing that. And man, that worked the best. I don't know that that's a model that can be easily replicated, but it totally flattened my learning curve once the acquisition did go forward, because I'd already done that big dip in the J curve when I was on somebody else's dime, because everybody does that. You have to learn it. And so by the time, and it ended up taking about 8 months, by the time we got to closing, he was able to get the relief from running the business. He was able to get the relief from worrying about who's going to, am I going to have a buyer or not? Because he knew he had a buyer. And I got the relief of, I'm already a couple $100,000 into the diligence here. I'm not going to leave this alone. And so it worked out for the best. But I write about that in the book, in the encouragement to say, if something pops up in diligence, and we all know something will pop up in diligence. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's pretty big. There are creative ways to solve for that when you know everybody's priorities.
That's a great story, and that goes really nicely with, I would say, a tip that another guest we had on, a gentleman named Ariz Dastur, who's this independent sponsor based out of Florida. His framing was, you've got to will deals into existence if they're good ones, and that sounds like that is exactly what you did with that creative structure. And back to one of our earlier points, a seller who's not fully aligned and not open kimono isn't going to accept that. So credit to you for also building a great relationship with the seller, and credit to the seller for being a good actor. Very good
And
story.
it comes full circle to the beginning of our conversation, which is if I had come from some random other industry, if I were an accountant trying to buy a pharmacy, I don't think that trust and patience would have been there. But because we spoke the same language and he could kind of see me as a successor, then we were able to get to a spot where we could do some creative deal making and make that time go by a little faster.
Excellent. Well, that's a great takeaway. And there's lots of creative ways to structure deals that aren't just seller note, rolled equity, earn out. There's lots of other things you can do, as you just noted. So very good, Lisa. Well, any parting thoughts you want to leave us with, how folks can get in touch with you, all that good stuff?
Yes. So my website is just lisapiercey.com. And the primary component on there is the book. The book is called Natural Born Entrepreneurs, which is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, anywhere you can buy your books, Audible and Kindle. And it's broken down not necessarily just for searchers, but for first-time business buyers who are mid-careerist. Obviously, I've spent the last half hour talking about how important I think it is to have that operational experience. The book is written specifically for people that were in a similar situation that I was. You know, I'd been in the workforce 10, 15 years, and it was fine. I was doing great. There wasn't a problem other than I just didn't feel like I was working at the top of my license. I wasn't fulfilled. And so the book talks about how those mid-careerists can evaluate the path of buying a business. And I'm going to tell you right now, there are plenty of warnings in there. And it's like, maybe you don't need to do that. Here's what you need to think about. You need to really seriously, and I use the term soberly and prayerfully consider if this is the right move for you. Because once you get to that mid-career point, you've got a lot of people depending on you. And so you can't just willy-nilly go do these things. About the first third of the book talks about a little bit about my journey, but it's mostly about here's it might do for you if you buy a business compared to a W-2 job. Also, here are the downsides of buying a business versus a W-2 job. You might actually want to stay in a W-2 job, but here's how to think through this. Then there is a section on writing your search thesis, just as I've just described. And then it goes from very beginning of deal sourcing all the way through first 100 days after acquisition in chronological order of okay, yes, I want to do this. How do you even find a deal? Where do you look? Where do you start looking? And then, how to evaluate that first SIM that you get, and then how to write an LOI and all through diligence and beyond. So it's a technical how-to, but there's a good component of, is this right for you?
And there's some good checklists and templates in there as well that people can lean on if you're kind of uncertain about, how to put something together. So yeah, really, really good, I would say, addition to the body of knowledge in the entrepreneurship through acquisition space.
Thanks, Sean.
Very good. Well, thanks so much for joining us, and hope you have a nice holiday season.
Appreciate it. You too. Enjoy the conversation.